In this video, we're going to learn about transfer learning. Now, this transfer learning technique is very commonly used in CNNs today. So let's dive right in. Transfer learning in neural networks. As we know by now, CNNs that are really deep require a tremendous amount of data for training. And when you don't have large amounts of data, then your network might end up overfitting on your small data set, and it will no longer generalize to the test set or when you use these models in real world applications. One way to overcome this problem is to use transfer learning. Now, the idea of transfer learning is pretty straightforward. First, we train the CNN on very large data sets such as ImageNet, and then we leverage the features that are trained from this large data set for then fine-tuning your model on the smaller data set. Let's look at this with an example. So here we first train this model. Here we have the VGG13 architecture, which performed really well on the ImageNet challenge. And we first trained this on the ImageNet dataset, which has about 14 million images. And then we fine-tune it on the smaller dataset. So one thing to note here is the number of classes that you have in your dataset. As you can see in the first figure here, we first trained this on ImageNet. So we have 1,000 classes here in the last fully connected layer. And now you'll probably have a different number of classes in your smaller data set. Let's say that we have C number of classes. So you will then have C number of units in your last fully connected layer of your networks. Then what you do is that you reinitialize this last fully connected layer with your preferred weight initialization method, and you freeze the weights of the previous layers in this network. And then you train a linear classifier where you only train the parameters of this last layer. So this works quite well if you have only small data set to train with. Now, if you have a little bit more data, but it's still not enough to train the entire network from scratch, what you can also do is to fine tune the whole network with weights pre-trained on the ImageNet dataset. So this means that you update the weights of the whole network and you reinitialize the fully connected layers of the network and you train them. So the more and more data that you have to train with, you can consider updating more and more layers of your network from deeper layers to earlier layers. This is the important thing to remember. So when you do this, the general strategy is that you want to reduce the learning rate from its initial learning rate, because the parameters that you have learned on the large data set is probably good already. And you just want to change them by a very small amount to then tune this performance on your other data set that you care about. When you're doing transfer learning, you can sort of imagine this 2x2 grid scenario that you can see here, where on one side we have very small amounts of data on the top and very large amounts of data in the data set on the bottom. Then on this top row here, we have very similar images on your data set. For example, if you train on ImageNet, which has 1,000 classes, and now you train on a smaller data set, which contains only classes which are a subset of these. So here we have very similar images in these cases. And then on the right, you have very different data sets. So generally, what you do when you have classes in your data set that are similar to the classes in the large data set that you first pre-trained on, then you just train a linear classifier on the last fully connected layer while keeping all other layers fixed pre-trained on the large data set or the ImageNet data set. Now, if you have more data to train with, then you can fine tune a few more layers, lowering the learning rate on those layers. But what you do when your data looks very different from ImageNet or whatever the last data set that you were pre-training on. For example, imagine that your small data set now, say it contains X-ray images, and your large data set was basically ImageNet, which has object categories such as cats and dogs and things like that. So these are also color images, and these are not X-ray images. So these two data sets are very different inherently, and you're going to have a bit of a trouble here. The last features might not be so informative then. So you might want to reinitialize large parts of your network and experiment to basically see what really works here. So this is less of a problem when you have, again, large data, because then you can actually fine tune larger parts of your network.
Okay, so another approach in transfer learning works with self-supervised pre-training. So self-supervised learning enables training on large data sets without external labels. Here, the methodology creates labels from the data itself. Let's have a look at the motivation for self-supervised learning. So we need to enable learning without labels, as labels are very expensive to obtain. For example, ImageNet is one of the largest labeled datasets from the natural world, and it contains over 1.2 million images from over 1,000 classes. So it's very commonly used for transfer learning in computer vision, which means that you pre-train a network for, let's say, image classification, and then reuse parts of the pre-trained network. Now this can be for classification again, but this can also be for object detection or some other task in a different domain. So ImageNet was annotated by crowdsourcing. So here this means that every participating person only had to label a small subset of the data set. So here the process of labeling was similar to when you, for example, authenticate yourself as a real person online. I'm sure most of us would have done this. And here we click the correct images by what we see in this authentication. And this is also known as bot authentication. Otherwise, it would have taken about 19 years for a small group of people to label the 1.2 million images in the ImageNet datasets. So here, no graduate student would want to do this project. But for this number of 19 years of labeling should give you an idea of how much effort is required to produce such a large labeled dataset, and why we need alternative learning algorithms such as self-supervised learning to work without any human annotations. So another motivation here is the availability of a large number of unlabeled data, such as videos on the internet. So for example, there are about 183 hours of content uploaded to YouTube every minute in 2022. And as we mentioned before, we cannot label such large amounts of data, but we would like to make use of the available amount of large data online that is provided to the internet every day. So self-supervised learning is a suitable alternative to supervised learning. As you remember, supervised learning always requires external labels, which is infeasible for the amount of hours in YouTube videos that are uploaded every minute on the internet. Let's have a look at some simple examples of self-supervised learning so you get a better understanding of this concept. So our general goal is that we want to learn about the content or the semantics in the image without any external labels. So one possible self-supervised learning methodology here is called rotation prediction. Here we want to rotate the image multiple times and then feed each rotation to a CNN network with, for example, 2 dense layers, and then we train the CNN to predict by which rotation this image was rotated by. So the final dense layer now predicts a 4-way softmax function. So the authors of this method hypothesized that the network learns to recognize semantics in the images. Now in our example, the network would now need to learn about how this object looks like in the natural position with the head at the top in order to tell if the image has been rotated in by different degrees of rotation. So So this learning entails that every object has a distinct orientation, and the network will learn about foreground objects while seeing them at different degrees of rotation during the training process. So another example here that we see is called context prediction. So for this self-supervised learning method, the image is divided into subparts. So here we can see that again our object is subdivided into 9 so-called patches that you see here, and each path here is encoded by a CNN, and the task of the network now is to predict the location of one patch relative to the other ones that you see in this example. So in our example, the CNN needs to predict in which relative position this object's t-shirt is most fitting, and in the same way as for the rotation prediction that we saw before, the network now needs to be able to understand the foreground object to know where these missing parts would then belong to. So the third example that we see here is called jigsaw puzzle. The idea here is to subdivide the image again into 9 patches equally as for context prediction, but in this case the network is challenged to predict the relative locations of all patches relative to each other. So therefore the same learning hypothesis as for the context prediction as we saw before applies here, just for a different task that we call as jigsaw puzzling. Okay, so now the last example that we see here is from natural language processing. So here the task is called next sentence prediction. So it is very simple to retrieve unlabeled text from the internet. For example, one can download an article from a newspaper or Wikipedia. And now in order to train a neural network for language understanding, we provide the network with a base sentence, and in this example, 3 possible consecutive sentences. Now the network is trained to predict the correct consecutive sentence which matches with the base sentence in terms of the related content. So in this example, to be or not to be is followed by that is the question to complete the unknown saying. Now in order to solve this challenge, the network needs to develop a deeper understanding of the meaning of a sentence. Just understanding single words is not going to help the network language model to solve this pre-training task. So I want to emphasize again that all the presented pre-training methods in this slide here aims to learn the underlying semantics of the medium. So this could be, for example, object representations in images that we saw in these 3 tasks here, or this could also be in the context of language understanding that we saw in this bottom example on the right here. So these tasks, however, don't share any similarities with the final task that we want to solve in the end. So self-supervised learning for transfer learning. So now I want you to have a look at how to integrate self-supervised learning as a solution for transfer learning. So at the top of the slide, it is shown that we can train a network with the presented self-supervised learning techniques from the previous slide, and then we can reuse parts of the network weights of the pre-trained model then for our target task in the end. Therefore, the last layers of the pre-trained model are commonly not transferred as they are task specific. So for example, here we can say that we train a CNN for rotation prediction, which was the first example that we saw in the previous slide, and then we fine-tune the model for image classification. The hypothesis of self-supervised learning thereby states that the network has already learned about the semantics of objects. Consequently, during fine-tuning, the network only has to assign a label to the learned representations. Therefore, it is common practice to freeze the pre-trained weights after self-supervised pre-training and then only fine-tune the layers in the end. So here these gray layers in the network are then freezed by learning on the self-supervised task, and while transfer learning, only the layers in the end are then fine-tuned on the target task that we care about in the end. So as large parts of the network here was pre-trained with the so-called pseudo labels using self-supervised learning, we then need only a few amount of labels here while fine-tuning this network on the target task. So self-supervised learning can be trained initially on large data sets where we don't need labels, and it is hypothesized that self-supervised learning can extract a deeper understanding of the observed medium, which then enables the network to superiorly learn to react to outliers in the end. So in this slide, I will introduce the concept of contrastive learning. So the previous slide showed computer vision examples of rotation prediction, jigsaw context prediction. These were published around 2016, and later the self-supervised pre-training for computer vision focused on this task that we call as contrastive learning due to its benefits on the performance that we achieve on the final task. So for contrastive learning, we will specifically look at the SimCLR model, which is then a pioneering paper in the contrastive learning domain. So the idea is very simple. So the algorithm selects one example image from the data set and independently augments the images 2 times. Then both augmentations are then encoded using a CNN and a multi-layer perceptron layer, which then contains multiple linear layers with activations, as we see here. So each augmented image is now represented as a high dimensional vector of, let's say, 128 bits. So the goal of contrastive learning is that 2 augmented versions of the same original image results in similar high dimensional vectors, as now only the difference between them is the applied augmentation. Therefore, contrastive learning considers other images in the dataset. So let's introduce some notations. So the 2 augmentations from the same original image are called positives. And as I said, we want the high dimensional representations to be as similar as possible, which is now denoted as the attract relationship in this diagram that we see here. In contrastive learning, the similarity of positive pairs is ensured by enforcing them to be more similar to each other in comparison to representations of the original image, which we now call as negatives. So to summarize, every image has an attract relationship with its augmentation that we call as positive, but the repelled relationship with other images in the dataset that we now call as the negative. So the high dimensional representations of an image should be similar to the high dimensional representations of another augmented version of the same original image, but dissimilar to representations originating from other images in the dataset. So for the dog image here shown on the left, all other images in the dataset, such as the chair image here shown on the right, are negatives. Only its own augmentation is the positive. For this example, they show images of 2 different classes, but in the original SimCLR model, also other instances of the same class. For example, another dog image will be denoted as a negative sample. So as you can probably guess, this contrastive objective is enforced with a softmax similarity loss function, which we will have a look at in detail in the next slide. Alright, so here on the left we see another visualization of the model's architecture that we just learned, the SimCLR model. So now the original image is denoted as X. So X is independently augmented 2 times with T and T prime, which are randomly sampled augmentations from capital T, resulting in X of I and X of J. Now the function F here corresponds to the CNN encoder, and the function G here corresponds to the multi-layer perceptron layers, which is essentially the prediction head. Now the goal is to maximize the agreement of 2 augmentations from the same original image with the following softmax function formula as you see. So here the negative log likelihood of the exponential similarity between Z of I and Z of J is divided by a temperature scalar tau. Again, Z of I and Z of J are representations after the prediction head as shown here on the left. So the complete term is then divided by sum over all the other examples apart from itself, which is the excluded by this k is not equal to I specification. And then again taking the exponential similarity, which is divided by the temperature scalar. So the temperature scalar is used for regularization and can be turned to enable a smooth training. We use the negative log likelihood to rescale this equation into maximizing the loss function, which ranges from plus infinity to 0. Now the agreement or the similarity is measured as the cosine similarity in the latent space. So cosine similarity is often used as a similarity matrix in the high dimensional space, as the Euclidean distance is not a very good degree of measurement with high dimensions. Okay, now to summarize, in this info NCE loss that we see here, the numerator corresponds to the similarity of the positive pairs, whereas the denominator measures the similarity to all pairs, both positive and negative pairs. One more thing that we need to note here in the formula that we see is that we have this ugly sum, but fortunately there are ways to vectorize the info NCE loss, so it's computationally more efficient. So the total loss is computed as sum of all combinations, so L of ij plus L of ji in this case. In the previous slides, we talked about randomly selecting 2 different augmentations to create a positive pair. So now I just want to show you the types of augmentations that SimCLR leverages in their paper. So you can see that they apply very basic augmentations of crop and resize, crop, resize and flip, color distortion with jitter, rotation, cutting out a square patch from the image, applying Gaussian noise, applying Gaussian blur, and applying the Sobel filter that we see here. So Sobel filtering is basically a computer vision technique that highlights edges in the images. So we can see that the edges around the dog here is more prominent after applying this filter. So in general, it's not really important in this context which augmentation SimCLR used, but I just wanted to show here that the augmentations are very commonly used computer vision techniques that are applied. But with the definition of similarity between positive pairs, that is the augmentations of the same image, versus negative pairs, in addition to the info NCE loss that we saw in the previous slide, SimCLR manages to outperform supervised ImageNet pre-training for different target tasks. Now this is a really impressive achievement. The authors of SimCLR now managed to outperform using any external manual labels, which we learned that this would have taken 19 years for a small research team. Here they used a very simple augmentation and training the network to be invariant to these augmentations by maximizing the similarity of the high dimensional vectors of the same original image. I hope now you understand why a lot of research investigates contrastive learning as a pre-training for computer vision, and I want to quickly give some more examples of how similarity can also be defined. Okay, so follow-up research often focuses on using different definitions of similarity. So in this slide, I want to show you three different examples that you see here. So the first example maximizes the agreement between different color channels. If you've already completed the computer vision lecture by Thomas Brooks, you might already be familiar with this concept that in computer vision we often define color spaces, and the most commonly known color space is the RGB, which corresponds to red, blue and green channels that are present in the image. But we also have the LAB color space. Here we separate it as L for lightness, chromaticity, which is the AB channel, which is also a distinct way. So in the contrastive multi-view coding paper, the authors proposed to convert this image into the LAB space and then use the L channel together with the AB channel as positive pairs for contrastive learning. Another methodology introduced in the same paper is based on videos. So here we need to know about a concept known as optical flow, which again you must be familiar with if you have taken the computer vision lecture. So in brief, optical flow is a measure of movement between two images or frames, which can be computed by having at least two subsequent frames in a video. So in this example that we see in the middle, the optical flow is here marked as the purple which defines the pixels that move between two consecutive frames. So in the scope of contrastive learning, the authors define triplets of positive samples. So the frame at time t forms a positive pair with the optical flow that we get from t to t plus 1, but also forms a positive pair with the frame at time t plus 1. Now we see another example on the right here. This is for indoor scenes, and we have a very famous data set that is called the NYU RGBD dataset, and this dataset has multiple modalities such as depth and color images. So here the CMC proposed to build positive pairs between the depth images, the luminance, which is the L channel, the chrominance, which is the AB from the LAB space, the semantic labels, as well as surface normals. So the positive pairs are formed in a many-to-many fashion, all modalities from a positive pair with all modalities of the same scene. Or this can also be done with the definition of a core view. This means that all modalities from a positive pair with a core view only. Alright, so let's summarize what we have previously seen. So we looked at self-prediction such as rotation prediction, jigsaw puzzle, and context prediction, which were self-prediction tasks that were introduced around 2016 for self-supervised pre-training in computer vision. So a lot of current research focuses on contrastive learning and defining new metrics of similarity. Additionally, another possibility for transfer learning is supervised image classification. So after pursuing any of the pre-training strategies on the left that is shown here, learned weights are partially transferred to the target architecture, and we can then fine-tune the model for different tasks such as image classification, captioning, object detection, semantic segmentation, and so on. So the tasks named on the right side of the slide are examples of target tasks that we want to solve. I again want to emphasize that we need labels typically to solve this target task, but now we only need to fine-tune the network as on few labels after we transfer the weights by self-supervised learning on any of these so-called self-supervised tasks or pretext tasks. So we can also do self-supervised learning for natural language processing. In fact, self-supervised learning initially originated in the natural language processing field. So here we will look at self-supervised learning examples for natural language processing. So one early work is the word-to-vec model. So the target goal of this model is to create similar word embeddings for synonyms. So in case you have a little background knowledge in natural language processing, commonly we want to encode words in the format of numerical vectors that are called as embeddings before feeding them to a natural language processing model. So there are various techniques to create those embeddings, and in recent years a lot of attention has been directed towards learning meaningful embeddings, which means synonyms should result in similar word embeddings. So commonly what we do is that a small neural network is trained to predict word embeddings, which are also the case of the word-to-vec model. And in fact, in word-to-vec, the network is trained with two supervised learning tasks. So the first task is called CBOW, or the continuous bag of words, which means that the network is trained to predict the current word from a window of surrounding words which is retrieved from a sentence. And the second learning task is called the skipgram. This then predicts parts of the sentence from a single word, which is shown on the right side here of the diagram. Consequently, CBOW and skipgram can be seen as self-supervised pre-training methods, while the final task is actually the synonym prediction task. As you see here on the right, the network now learns that the man and the woman, or the king and the queen, are equally related. So the network puts the word king closer to the man than woman, as it understands that the semantics of words from being continuously trained in a self-supervised manner. Similarly, the network also recognizes the similarity of verb tenses that we see on the right. But word2vec produces context-free word embeddings. This means that, for example, he is running a race or he is running an enterprise cannot be differentiated, as word embeddings are predicted for single words after pre-training. Okay, so another recent model and application of self-supervised learning in natural language processing is the very famous BERT model. So in this paper, the authors introduce a novel transformer architecture, but in the scope of this lecture, we want to focus on the self-supervised pre-training that they employ. So the general pre-training idea includes that the model receives two sentences as input and masks some of the words from these sentences. So masking means that single words in a sentence are replaced by a dummy token, or other words can also be used according to a predefined probability score. Then the language model is challenged to predict if the provided sentences are consecutive and predict or correct the masked words. Through this pre-training method, the BERT model can learn the semantics of language, and it produces very contextualized word embeddings that adapt according to the surrounding sentence. Now let's summarize what we have learned for transfer learning in natural language processing. So next sentence prediction and masked language modeling as used in BERT are self-supervised pre-training tasks for natural language processing. So these self-supervised learning techniques can enable the network to learn contextualized word embeddings, which can then be used to solve target tasks of, for example, question and answering, sentiment classification, entailment classification, grammar checking, machine translation, and so on. So in general, I want to highlight that self-supervised learning is very prevalent in natural language processing due to its very high performance on a wide variety of tasks. However, the leveraged self-supervised learning approaches used for computer vision and natural language processing, as you can guess, are very different from each other. So in computer vision, contrastive learning is preferred, whereas in natural language processing, so-called generative models such as word or sentence prediction give much superior results at this moment in time. Alright, so another very closely related field is meta-learning. So meta-learning now goes beyond transfer learning for one task, and now it pre-trains on multiple tasks. So the basic idea includes that you prepare networks to learn faster. So it is also referred to as the research field of learning how to learn fast. So this learning concept is loosely inspired by how children typically learn, and it's believed that the more a child has already learned before, the more the child will be better at learning new tasks. So meta-learning follows the same principle, and it learns assumptions, which are also called inductive bias or priors during training on learning multiple tasks. So these priors can then be transferred to a new task at a later stage. Due to this reason, meta-learning is closely related to continual learning, online learning, and multitask learning. Now, these are different learning concepts. So first, continual learning describes the process of learning a sequence of tasks. Thereby, it is ensured that the old task is not forgotten while learning a new task. Online learning is defined as considering training samples only once, which means in this context that you don't move back to an old task. And at last, multitask learning refers to jointly learning several tasks and benefiting from the regularization as well as the compute and the memory sharing that you will get by doing multitask learning. Meta-learning is useful in a wide variety of different scenarios, specifically for rare events with very little data or high data collection costs, as well as in scenarios where you have privacy issues. So in the previous slide, we already mentioned that meta-learning aims to learn an inductive bias or prior, which can be transferred to new tasks. So I want to give some examples of inductive biases that can be learned during meta-learning. So meta-learning can be aimed at learning better architectures, which include learning the number and kind of layers, as well as hyperparameters such as learning rate, which works for many different tasks. So meta-learning can also be directed towards learning good initial weights. So this is a direct link to transfer learning methods such as supervised and self-supervised learning, which we saw in the previous slide. But here I want you to remember at this point that meta-learning algorithms retrieve these weights from training on multiple tasks, whereas during supervised or self-supervised transfer learning, the weights are only transferred from one or at most two pre-training tasks. So another direction of meta-learning concerns the learning of better loss or reward functions, which work superiorly for a wide variety of different tasks. Okay, so in meta-learning, we generally define three research pillars: architectures or pipelines, learning algorithms or model parameters, learning environments or task generation. So the research in architecture of pipelines addresses questions such as which architecture or pipeline can be used to find the best model, or which architectures are more transferable. So this research pillar also concerns building hierarchical building blocks which can be used in networks and measuring the similarity of tasks. The second pillar concerns learning algorithms, therefore focuses on research on learning different learner models. So in meta-learning, there are also commonly two models, the learner and the architecture to be leveraged on multiple tasks. So the learner evaluates the model and initiates changes to the target model. Consequently, this research area determines suitable configurations or hyperparameters for learners and how to train the learner of the meta-learning algorithm. Okay, so the last pillar concerns task generation. In order to train good meta-learning models, this research area explores how to create good learning environments for them. Environments or tasks have to find a good trade-off of the difficulty to challenge the meta-learning algorithm in the right amount. So in general, if you're interested in this topic, want to know more about the current research in meta-learning, we suggest that you refer to the AutoML lecture which is organized by Frank's team. There you will find an entire lecture on meta-learning. Alright, so I want to leave you in the end with some questions to answer for yourself. The first question is, how will you perform transfer learning when you have very little data but your data is quite similar to ImageNet? The second question is, why is the model prediction head commonly not transferred after subsupervised learning? So if you remember in our subsupervised learning slides, we saw that only the initial part of the network that we denoted in gray is then transferred for fine-tuning on the target task, and typically the layers that are towards the end are not transferred. So here the question is, why is that the layers towards the end, which is the model prediction head, is not transferred for self-supervised pre-training? The last question is an application of what you have just learned. So can you still perform transfer learning if the network architecture that you used to first pre-train on ImageNet is now completely different from the architecture that you're going to use for training on your small data set, which is the target task? So this brings us to the end of this video. I will see you in the next video. Thank you.